Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who calls you mother. I discovered this truth on a Tuesday morning when I found the insurance paperwork hidden under a stack of mail on my kitchen counter. The beneficiary line read clear as daylight, Trevor Hoffman, my only son. The policy amount made my hands shake. $2 million on my life. Without my knowledge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Blanche Hoffman, and for 68 years, I believed that blood meant protection. I raised my son Trevor in the rolling hills of Cedar Springs, Tennessee, in a white farmhouse that had belonged to my grandmother before me. The house sat on 43 acres of fertile land, with a creek running through the back pasture, and an old red barn that Trevor used to hide in when he was avoiding his chores. Those were simpler days, when Trevor was 8 years old and still thought I hung the moon. He would follow me around the property as I tended to the vegetable garden, his small hands eager to help plant tomatoes and pull weeds. We raised chickens together, and I taught him the value of hard work by having him collect eggs every morning before school. He was a serious child, always asking questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how much money we had in the bank. That should have been my first warning sign, but back then I thought his curiosity about finances was just natural intelligence. Trevor was brilliant, there was no denying that. He read before kindergarten, excelled in mathematics, and by high school he was already talking about business school and investment strategies. I was proud of his ambition, proud that my boy had inherited his grandfather's sharp mind for numbers. My late husband Raymond had passed when Trevor was only 12. Leaving us with a substantial inheritance that included the family property, a successful grain elevator business in town, and several rental properties scattered throughout the county. Raymond had been meticulous about financial planning, and his life insurance policy had set us up comfortably for the rest of our lives. I never had to worry about money, and neither would Trevor when his time came. After Raymond's death, it was just Trevor and me against the world. I threw myself into being both mother and father to him, driving him to baseball practice, helping with homework, and making sure he understood the importance of integrity and family loyalty. Trevor seemed to appreciate everything I did for him. He would hug me tight after I'd spent hours helping him with a science project, and tell me I was the best mom in the world. When Trevor graduated valedictorian from Cedar Springs High School, I felt like my heart might burst with pride. He had been accepted to Vanderbilt University with a partial scholarship, and I was more than happy to cover the remaining expenses. Education was the one thing I would never stint on, not when it came to my boy's future. I sold 2 of the rental properties to pay for his tuition, room, and board, and I never once complained about the sacrifice. Trevor thrived at Vanderbilt. He double majored in business and finance, graduated summa cum laude, and immediately landed a position at a prestigious investment firm in Nashville. He moved into a sleek downtown apartment, bought expensive suits, and started driving a BMW that cost more than most people made in a year. I was so proud of his success, proud that all my years of hard work and sacrifice had paid off. He would call me every Sunday afternoon, usually while he was driving between appointments or sitting in his office working late. Our conversations were warm and familiar, filled with updates about his work, his social life, and his plans for the future. He talked about wanting to settle down someday, maybe move back to Cedar Springs and raise his own family on the property where he'd grown up. Those conversations filled me with such hope and contentment. My son was successful, ambitious, and still loved his old mother enough to call every week. When Trevor turned 30, he surprised me by bringing home a girlfriend for Christmas. Her name was Celeste, and she was everything I had hoped my future daughter-in-law would be. She was beautiful, educated, and charming, with a master's degree in marketing and a warm smile that lit up the whole room. She complimented my cooking, admired the family photographs lining the hallway, and seemed genuinely interested in hearing stories about Trevor's childhood. Celeste worked for a major corporation in Nashville, managing social media campaigns for luxury brands. She was sophisticated and well-traveled, but she never made me feel small or unsophisticated. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about farm life and seemed fascinated by the history of our property. She and Trevor made a striking couple, both of them polished and successful, and I could easily picture them building a beautiful life together. That Christmas was one of the happiest I could remember since Raymond's death. The house felt alive again with young voices and laughter. Trevor and Celeste helped me decorate the tree, and we spent Christmas Eve playing board games by the fireplace while snow fell softly outside the windows. Celeste insisted on helping me cook Christmas dinner, and she was surprisingly skilled in the kitchen despite her corporate background. On Christmas morning, Trevor gave me a beautiful pearl necklace that had belonged to his grandmother on Raymond's side. He said he'd been saving it for the right moment, and he wanted me to have it as a symbol of how much our family traditions meant to him. I cried when I opened the jewelry box, touched by his thoughtfulness and the connection to my late mother-in-law. 6 months later, Trevor called to tell me he had proposed to Celeste during a weekend trip to Paris. She had said yes, of course, and they were planning a summer wedding. I was overjoyed and immediately began making plans to host their engagement party at the farmhouse. I wanted everything to be perfect for them, wanted to show Celeste that she was truly welcome in our family. The engagement party was a magical evening. I hired a catering company from Nashville, strung lights throughout the garden, and invited everyone who mattered to us in Cedar Springs. Trevor looked handsome in his navy blazer, and Celeste was radiant in a flowing yellow dress that made her look like sunshine itself. They danced to their favorite song while our guests watched with warm smiles, and I felt such deep satisfaction knowing that my son had found his perfect match. Trevor's best man gave a toast that night that brought tears to my eyes. He talked about how Trevor always spoke about his mother with such love and respect, how he credited me with teaching him the values that had made him successful. He said Trevor was the kind of man who would always take care of the people he loved, and that Celeste was lucky to be marrying into such a close-knit family. I should have been paying more attention to the details that night, should have noticed the way Trevor and Celeste exchanged certain looks when they thought no one was watching. I should have wondered why they seemed so interested in touring every room of the house, asking questions about the property boundaries and the value of the antique furniture. But I was too caught up in the joy of the moment, too happy to see my son settled and content. The wedding was held at the country club in Nashville, an elegant affair with 200 guests and every detail perfectly coordinated. I wore a dusty rose dress that Celeste had helped me pick out, and I felt beautiful and proud as I walked down the aisle on Trevor's arm. During the ceremony, I couldn't stop smiling as I watched my son promise to love and cherish the woman who would hopefully give me grandchildren someday. At the reception, Trevor danced with me to In My Daughter's Eyes, even though the lyrics were meant for a father and daughter. He whispered in my ear that I was the most important woman in his life, and that would never change, not even now that he was married. I held him tight during that dance, memorizing the moment and the feeling of being so completely loved and appreciated. After the honeymoon, Trevor and Celeste settled into married life in Nashville. They bought a beautiful Tudor-style house in an upscale neighborhood, and I visited them several times to help Celeste decorate and organize. She had exquisite taste, and their home was featured in a local magazine as an example of Southern elegance meets modern luxury. For the first 2 years of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. They came to visit me in Cedar Springs at least once a month, usually staying for the weekend and helping me with projects around the property. Trevor would fix whatever needed repairing, while Celeste and I would work in the garden or go antique shopping in town. They talked about starting a family soon, and I dreamed about the day I would become a grandmother. Trevor had been promoted to senior vice president at his firm, and he was making more money than Raymond and I had ever imagined possible. He bought me expensive gifts for my birthday and Christmas, always insisting that I deserved the best of everything. He upgraded my old truck to a new SUV, installed a security system in the farmhouse, and paid for me to take a luxury cruise to Alaska that I had mentioned wanting to do someday. I felt so blessed to have a son who was not only successful but also generous and thoughtful. My friends in town were always commenting on how lucky I was, how rare it was to have a child who remembered to take care of their parents. I would beam with pride whenever someone complimented Trevor, and I never missed an opportunity to brag about his accomplishments and his devotion to family. Looking back now, I realize that Trevor's generosity should have made me more suspicious, not more grateful. A man who makes 6 figures doesn't usually need to worry about his mother's financial security unless he has plans for that security. But at the time, I saw his gifts and gestures as proof of his love, evidence that I had raised him right and that our bond was unbreakable. The first crack in my perfect world came during their third Christmas as a married couple. I had prepared the guest room for them as usual, putting fresh flowers on the nightstand and stocking the bathroom with their favorite toiletries. But when they arrived, Trevor seemed distracted and kept checking his phone during dinner. Celeste was quieter than usual, and when I asked if everything was all right, she smiled tightly and said they were just dealing with some work stress. That night, I overheard them talking in their room through the thin walls of the old farmhouse. Trevor was saying something about timelines and opportunities, while Celeste was worried about appearances and family relationships. I couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was serious and urgent in a way that made my stomach feel unsettled. The next morning at breakfast, Trevor brought up the subject of my estate planning. He said he had been thinking about my future and wanted to make sure I had everything properly organized for tax purposes. He offered to connect me with his financial advisor, someone who could help me structure my assets more efficiently. When I told him that Raymond had left everything in good order, and I was comfortable with my current arrangements, Trevor persisted. He explained that estate laws had changed since Raymond's death, and there might be opportunities to save significant money on taxes if I reorganized things properly. He seemed particularly interested in the property itself, asking about the current assessed value and whether I had considered putting it in a trust. His questions felt intrusive in a way they never had before, but I attributed his curiosity to professional habit rather than personal interest. Celeste chimed in to support Trevor's suggestions, saying that her own parents had recently updated their estate planning and had been amazed by how much money they could save with the right legal structures. She spoke with such authority about financial matters that I felt foolish for not having considered these options myself. Maybe I was being old-fashioned and stubborn, clinging to Raymond's arrangements simply because they were familiar. By the time they left that Sunday afternoon, Trevor had convinced me to at least meet with his financial advisor to get a second opinion on my current situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He said it couldn't hurt to have a consultation, and if I decided not to make any changes, that would be fine too. He just wanted to make sure I was making informed decisions about my financial future. I agreed to the meeting mostly to make Trevor happy, but as I watched their car disappear down the gravel driveway, I felt an odd sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. Something about our conversation had felt different, more calculated and less affectionate than our usual family discussions. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my son might have motivations that weren't entirely pure. That night, I sat in Raymond's old recliner and tried to shake off my uncomfortable feelings. Trevor was a successful financial professional who genuinely wanted to help his mother make smart decisions about her money. There was nothing sinister about his suggestions, nothing unusual about a son wanting to ensure his parents' financial security. I was probably just being paranoid, reading too much into a perfectly normal conversation about practical matters. But as I lay in bed that night, I kept thinking about the urgency in Trevor's voice, and the way Celeste had looked at him when she thought I wasn't watching. There had been something almost conspiratorial about their behavior, as if they were working from a script they had rehearsed beforehand. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my imagination was running away with me. Trevor loved me, and he would never do anything to hurt me. I was wrong about that, but it would be several more months before I discovered just how wrong I had been. The meeting with Trevor's financial advisor took place on a gray February morning in Nashville. Trevor had insisted on driving me to the appointment, saying he wanted to be there to help explain any complex financial concepts that might be confusing. I appreciated his thoughtfulness, though I was perfectly capable of understanding my own financial situation without translation. The advisor's office was in a gleaming downtown tower, all glass and steel and modern furniture that probably cost more than my car. Trevor seemed completely at home in this environment, shaking hands with the receptionist and chatting casually with the advisor about mutual acquaintances in the financial industry. I felt somewhat out of place in my simple dress and sensible shoes, but I reminded myself that I was here as a successful woman with substantial assets, not a charity case needing help. The advisor, whose name was Jonathan Reeves, was younger than I had expected, probably close to Trevor's age, with an expensive haircut and a suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically for him. He spoke with the kind of polished confidence that comes from years of convincing people to trust him with their money. His office walls were covered with certificates and awards, and his desk was positioned to give him a commanding view of the Nashville skyline. Jonathan began the meeting by reviewing my current financial situation, which Trevor had apparently outlined for him in advance. He seemed already familiar with the details of my property, my investment accounts, and my monthly expenses. While I appreciated the efficiency, I felt slightly uncomfortable that my personal financial information had been discussed without my direct participation. The presentation Jonathan gave was impressive and thorough, complete with charts and projections showing how various estate planning strategies could benefit my heirs. He talked about trust structures, tax optimization, and wealth preservation techniques that could potentially save hundreds of thousands of dollars in estate taxes. Everything he said made logical sense, and his recommendations seemed genuinely designed to protect my assets and maximize their value for future generations. However, there was something about the way Trevor participated in the meeting that began to bother me as the presentation continued. He asked very specific questions about timelines and liquidity, wanting to know exactly when various strategies would take effect and how quickly assets could be accessed under different scenarios. His questions seemed more focused on immediate access to funds rather than long-term wealth preservation. When Jonathan suggested that I consider a revocable living trust with Trevor as the primary trustee, I asked what that would mean in practical terms. Jonathan explained that it would allow Trevor to manage my affairs if I ever became incapacitated, and it would also streamline the inheritance process after my death. The trust would give Trevor significant control over my assets while I was still alive, but only if I was unable to manage them myself. Trevor was enthusiastic about this suggestion, saying it would give him peace of mind to know that my affairs were properly organized and protected. He painted a picture of himself as a devoted son who simply wanted to ensure that his mother's golden years were comfortable and worry-free. His concern seemed genuine, and I found myself nodding along with his reasoning. But then Jonathan mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He casually referenced the life insurance policy that Trevor had mentioned, saying that it would provide excellent liquidity to cover any estate taxes or final expenses. When I asked what life insurance policy he was referring to, both Jonathan and Trevor looked surprised, as if they assumed I already knew about it. Trevor quickly explained that he had taken out a policy on my life to protect against the financial burden that my final expenses might place on the family. He said it was a common practice among financial professionals, a way to ensure that estate settlements didn't create cash flow problems for surviving family members. The policy was relatively new, he said, and he hadn't mentioned it because he didn't want to worry me with morbid discussions about death and insurance. I sat in that gleaming office, surrounded by certificates and awards and floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt the world shift beneath my feet. My son had taken out a life insurance policy on me without my knowledge or consent. He was discussing my death as if it were a financial opportunity rather than a devastating loss. Everything about the meeting suddenly felt predatory rather than protective. I managed to maintain my composure for the rest of the appointment, asking polite questions and listening to Jonathan's recommendations with what I hoped appeared to be thoughtful consideration. But inside I was reeling from the discovery that Trevor had been planning for my death in ways I had never imagined. The trust structures and estate planning strategies took on a sinister cast when viewed through the lens of a life insurance policy I had never authorized. On the drive back to Cedar Springs, Trevor was excited about the possibilities Jonathan had presented. He talked about how much money the trust structures could save, how efficiently the estate could be settled, and how beneficial the life insurance policy would be for covering immediate expenses. He spoke about my death with the casual detachment of someone discussing a business transaction, and I felt sick to my stomach listening to him. When I asked him directly about the insurance policy, Trevor became defensive. He said he was hurt, that I didn't trust his judgment, that he was only trying to protect our family's financial interests. He accused me of being paranoid and ungrateful, pointing out all the ways he had helped me over the years, and questioning why I was suddenly suspicious of his motives. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. A son who had taken out life insurance for legitimate reasons would have been apologetic about the lack of communication, eager to explain his reasoning and provide documentation to ease my concerns. Trevor's anger and defensiveness suggested that he had something to hide, something that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny if I decided to investigate further. That night, Alone in the farmhouse that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a target, I began to understand that the son I had raised and loved and trusted might be capable of things I had never imagined. The life insurance policy was just the beginning, I suspected. If Trevor was willing to bet $2 million on my death, what else might he be willing to do to collect on that bet? I didn't sleep much that night, lying in my bed and listening to every creak and groan of the old house, wondering if my own son posed a threat to my safety. It was a thought so horrifying and unnatural that my mind kept rejecting it, insisting that there had to be some innocent explanation for everything I had discovered. But deep down, in the part of my soul that had kept me alive and safe for 68 years, I knew the truth. Trevor had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as his inheritance. And if I wanted to survive long enough to do something about it, I was going to have to start treating him like the dangerous stranger he had apparently become. The weeks following my discovery of the life insurance policy passed in a strange haze of hypervigilance and denial. I found myself analyzing every conversation with Trevor, searching for hidden meanings in his casual comments about my health, my daily routines, and my future plans. When he called on his usual Sunday afternoons, I listened with new ears to the questions he asked about whether I was eating well, sleeping soundly, and taking my medications properly. What had once seemed like loving concern from a devoted son now felt like surveillance from someone with a vested interest in my mortality. Trevor had always been attentive to my well-being, but now I wondered if his attention had darker motivations. When he asked if I was still taking my evening walks alone around the property, was he worried about my safety or hoping for an opportunity that might look like an accident? I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that grief and loneliness had made me suspicious of perfectly innocent behavior. Trevor was a successful businessman who dealt with insurance policies and estate planning as part of his professional life. Taking out a policy on his elderly mother might have been nothing more than prudent financial planning, the kind of thing wealthy families did to protect their assets. But I couldn't shake the memory of how he had reacted when I questioned him about it. His anger had been too quick, too defensive, too calculated. A son with nothing to hide would have patiently explained his reasoning and offered to show me the policy documents. Trevor's immediate shift to offense, his accusations of paranoia and ingratitude, suggested someone who had been caught doing something he knew was wrong. The first obvious change in Trevor's behavior came during his next visit to Cedar Springs. He arrived on a Saturday morning in March, alone this time, saying that Celeste was dealing with a deadline at work and couldn't get away. I was disappointed not to see her, as I had grown genuinely fond of my daughter-in-law and enjoyed her company during their visits. Trevor seemed more focused on the property itself during this visit, walking the boundaries with a surveyor's intensity and asking detailed questions about the condition of various structures. He spent a long time examining the old well house, the barn foundation, and the electrical systems in the main house. When I asked why he was so interested in these technical details, he said he was concerned about my safety living alone in such an old house. His concern might have been touching if it hadn't felt so clinical. Trevor moved through my home like an appraiser rather than a son, noting which fixtures were original, which rooms had been updated, and what repairs might be needed in the near future. He took photographs of various rooms, claiming he wanted to research contractors who could help with maintenance projects. But something about his documentation felt invasive and calculating. During lunch, Trevor brought up the subject of my daily routines with a level of detail that made me uncomfortable. He wanted to know what time I went to bed, what time I woke up, whether I kept regular schedules for meals and medication. He asked about my social activities, my appointments in town, and how often I drove to Nashville to shop or visit doctors. When I asked why he needed to know so much about my schedule, Trevor said he was thinking about hiring a companion or housekeeper to help me manage the property and provide some company during my daily activities. He painted a picture of a kind, trustworthy person who could assist with cooking, cleaning, and errands, while also serving as a safety net in case of medical emergencies. The idea wasn't entirely without merit. The farmhouse was large and demanding to maintain, and I did sometimes feel isolated during the long winter months, when I went days without seeing another person. A companion might provide both practical help and emotional support, especially as I continued to age and my physical capabilities inevitably declined. But Trevor's approach to discussing this possibility felt more like a business negotiation than a family conversation. He had already researched agencies that provided companion services, and he had specific questions about which rooms a live-in helper might use, what access they would need to different areas of the house, and what level of authority they should have over my daily decisions. Most disturbing was his suggestion that such a companion should have some medical training and the ability to monitor my health conditions on a daily basis. He said it would be important for someone to keep track of my medications, my blood pressure, and any symptoms that might indicate developing health problems. This level of medical oversight seemed excessive for someone who was generally healthy and mentally sharp. I told Trevor I would think about his suggestion, but privately I was alarmed by how thoroughly he had planned this arrangement without consulting me first. It felt less like a son wanting to ensure his mother's well-being and more like someone establishing surveillance and control over a target. The companion he described would be perfectly positioned to monitor my vulnerabilities and report back to him about my daily habits and health status. That evening, Trevor asked to see my medication cabinet, claiming he wanted to make sure I was organizing my prescriptions safely and taking them according to the proper schedules. I had been managing my own medications successfully for decades, but he insisted that medication errors were a leading cause of hospitalizations among elderly people living alone. As he examined my prescriptions, Trevor asked detailed questions about dosages, timing, and side effects. He wanted to know which medications were essential and which were optional, which ones affected my sleep or alertness, and what symptoms I experienced if I missed doses. His questions felt more like an interrogation than a wellness check, and I found myself being deliberately vague in my responses. Trevor also spent considerable time going through my important documents that weekend, claiming he wanted to make sure everything was properly organized and easily accessible in case of an emergency. He photographed the location of my will, my insurance policies, my property deeds, and my financial account information. When I asked why he needed photographic records of these documents, he said it would help him assist me more efficiently if I ever needed help managing my affairs. The boundary between helpful son and controlling predator was becoming increasingly blurred. Every suggestion Trevor made was reasonable on its surface, the kind of thing a caring child might propose for an aging parent. But the cumulative effect of his interest in my health, my routines, my medications, and my legal documents felt more like preparation for something sinister than genuine concern for my well-being. On Sunday morning, Trevor surprised me by suggesting we visit the family cemetery where Raymond was buried. We hadn't been there together since the anniversary of Raymond's death the previous year, and I was touched that he wanted to pay his respects to his father. We drove to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, where generations of my family had been laid to rest among rolling hills and ancient oak trees. Standing beside Raymond's grave, Trevor became unexpectedly emotional. He talked about how much he missed his father, how difficult it had been to grow up without that strong male influence, and how grateful he was that I had been both mother and father to him during his formative years. His words were beautiful and heartfelt, and for a moment I felt guilty for doubting his motives. But then Trevor began talking about his own mortality, about how life was unpredictable and people could die suddenly without warning. He mentioned Raymond's heart attack, how it had come without any previous symptoms or health concerns. He talked about the importance of being prepared for death, of having proper insurance and legal documents in place to protect surviving family members. As we stood in that peaceful cemetery surrounded by weathered headstones and spring flowers, Trevor asked me where I wanted to be buried when my time came. Did I want to be laid to rest beside Raymond, or would I prefer a different location? Had I made specific arrangements for my funeral services, or would I want him to handle those details when the time came? These were not unreasonable questions for a son to ask his elderly mother, but the timing and context made them feel morbid and calculated. Trevor seemed less interested in honoring my wishes than in understanding the logistical details of my death. His questions focused on timelines, costs, and administrative procedures, rather than emotional or spiritual considerations. The drive home from the cemetery was quiet, with Trevor lost in thought and me struggling to process the growing evidence that my son might be planning for my death more actively than any loving child should. When we reached the farmhouse, Trevor spent another hour taking photographs of the exterior. claiming he wanted to research roofing contractors and exterior maintenance companies. As he prepared to leave that Sunday afternoon, Trevor hugged me tightly and told me how much he loved me, how important I was to him, and how he wanted to make sure I was protected and cared for in every possible way. His words were perfect. His affection seemed genuine, and his concern appeared to come from a place of deep love and respect. But something in his eyes didn't match his words. There was a distance there, a calculation that reminded me more of a businessman evaluating an asset than a son expressing love for his mother. As I watched him drive away, I realized that Trevor had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to be solved. Over the following weeks, Trevor's phone calls became more frequent and more intrusive. He would call at unusual times, claiming he was just checking to make sure I was all right, but his questions always focused on my immediate activities and my physical condition. He wanted to know if I was feeling tired, if I had experienced any chest pains or shortness of breath, if I had been sleeping well or having any unusual symptoms. These health check-ins were accompanied by increasingly urgent suggestions about medical care. Trevor thought I should have more frequent doctor appointments, more comprehensive blood work, and perhaps some specialist consultations to make sure I wasn't developing any serious conditions. He offered to schedule these appointments himself and to accompany me to make sure I was getting the best possible care. When I told Trevor I felt fine and didn't need additional medical attention, he became frustrated with what he called my stubborn independence. He said that elderly people often didn't recognize their own health problems, that denial was a common response to aging, and that I needed to be more proactive about preventative care. His concern sounded reasonable, but it felt like pressure rather than love. Trevor also began making suggestions about my living situation that grew more insistent with each conversation. He thought the farmhouse was too isolated, too difficult to maintain, and potentially dangerous for someone my age. He had researched several senior living communities in Nashville that offered various levels of care and assistance, and he wanted me to visit them to see what options might be available. The communities Trevor recommended were expensive and luxurious, with beautiful facilities and comprehensive services. He showed me glossy brochures featuring happy seniors enjoying social activities, gourmet meals, and on-site medical care. These places looked pleasant and well-managed, but they would also mean giving up my independence, my privacy, and my connection to the land that had been in my family for generations. When I expressed reluctance to consider moving to a senior community, Trevor became impatient with what he called my irrational attachment to the property. He said the farmhouse was just a building, that my safety and comfort were more important than sentimental memories. He pointed out that maintaining the property was becoming increasingly difficult and expensive, and that the money from selling it could ensure my financial security for the rest of my life. Trevor's arguments were logical and practical, but they ignored the emotional and spiritual significance of the land to me and to our family history. The farmhouse wasn't just a building, it was the place where I had raised him, where Raymond and I had built our life together, where generations of my ancestors had lived and died and been buried. Asking me to abandon all of that felt like asking me to abandon my identity. More troubling was Trevor's apparent inability to understand why I would resist his suggestions. A loving son might be disappointed by his mother's reluctance to prioritize safety over sentimentality, but he would respect her autonomy and work to find compromises that honored both practical concerns and emotional needs. Trevor's impatience and frustration suggested someone who saw my resistance as an obstacle to his plans, rather than a legitimate expression of my own preferences. The breaking point came during a phone conversation in early April. Trevor called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual for him, and immediately began questioning me about my day in exhaustive detail. He wanted to know everything I had eaten, every activity I had performed, every person I had spoken with, and every symptom or physical sensation I had experienced. When I asked why he needed such detailed information about my daily life, Trevor said he was concerned that I might be having minor health problems that I wasn't recognizing or reporting properly. He had been researching age-related health conditions, and he thought I might be exhibiting early symptoms of various serious diseases. He wanted me to keep a daily health log that I could share with him so he could monitor my condition more effectively. The idea of maintaining a daily health log for my son's review felt like turning myself into a patient under surveillance, rather than a mother receiving care from a loving child. Trevor's request crossed a boundary between appropriate concern and inappropriate control, and I found myself finally saying what I had been thinking for weeks. I told Trevor that his level of interest in my health, my daily routines, and my mortality felt excessive and uncomfortable. I said that while I appreciated his concern, I was a capable adult who could manage my own medical care and make my own decisions about my living situation. I suggested that perhaps he was letting his anxiety about losing me cloud his judgment about what kind of support I actually needed. Trevor's response was immediate and harsh. He accused me of being ungrateful for everything he had done for me, paranoid about his motives, and incapable of making rational decisions about my own well-being. He said that elderly people often became defensive and suspicious when their adult children tried to help them, and that my resistance to his suggestions was proof that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. The cruelty of his words was shocking, but even more shocking was the calculated way he delivered them. Trevor wasn't speaking from a place of hurt or frustration. He was attacking my competence and autonomy in a way that felt rehearsed and strategic. He seemed to be building a case for my incapacity, rather than expressing genuine concern for my welfare. When I told Trevor that his accusations were hurtful and unfair, he shifted tactics and became coldly professional. He said that family emotions were clouding both of our judgment, and that we needed to approach my situation more objectively. He suggested that I undergo a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation to establish a baseline for my current capabilities, and to identify any areas where I might need assistance. The evaluation Trevor proposed would be conducted by medical professionals he had already identified, and would include cognitive testing, physical assessments, and psychological interviews. The results would provide objective evidence of my current mental and physical status, and they would serve as a benchmark for measuring any future changes in my condition. Trevor presented this evaluation as something that would benefit both of us by removing emotional subjectivity from our discussions about my care needs. If the results showed that I was fully competent and capable of independent living, he would respect my autonomy and stop pressuring me about lifestyle changes. But if the evaluation revealed any areas of concern, I would need to accept his guidance about appropriate interventions. It was a clever trap disguised as a reasonable compromise. Trevor had positioned himself as the rational actor trying to find objective solutions, while casting me as the emotional and potentially incompetent party who needed professional assessment. If I agreed to the evaluation, I would be validating his concerns about my competence and giving him ammunition to use against me if the results weren't to his liking. If I refused the evaluation, he could use my refusal as evidence of my irrationality and defensiveness. I told Trevor I would consider his suggestion, but privately I was appalled by how manipulative and calculated his approach had become. This wasn't the behavior of a loving son who was genuinely worried about his mother's well-being. This was the behavior of someone who was systematically undermining my autonomy and building a case for taking control of my life and my assets. That night, as I sat in my living room looking out at the rolling hills that had been my sanctuary for so many decades, I faced the terrible truth that I had been avoiding for weeks. My son, the boy I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, had become a threat to my safety and my freedom. The life insurance policy wasn't just a financial instrument. It was evidence of Trevor's willingness to profit from my death. And if Trevor was willing to profit from my death, I had to consider the possibility that he might also be willing to arrange it. The thought was so horrible and unnatural that every fiber of my being wanted to reject it, but I could no longer ignore the evidence of his planning and preparation. My son was treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved, and that made me more vulnerable than I had ever been in my life. I didn't sleep that night, lying in my bed and listening to every sound the old house made, wondering if Trevor had already begun implementing whatever plan he had in mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant sound of a car on the county road made me wonder if my time was running out faster than I realized. By morning, I had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I was going to treat my own son as a potential enemy, and I was going to take whatever steps were necessary to protect myself from the person who should have been protecting me. It was a decision that broke my heart, but it might also save my life. The morning I discovered the extent of Trevor's deception began like any other Tuesday in May. I had awakened early, as was my habit, and was enjoying my coffee on the front porch while watching the sunrise paint the hills in shades of gold and amber. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the neighboring pasture. It should have been a perfect moment of peace and contentment, but my newfound awareness of Trevor's true nature had robbed me of the ability to enjoy such simple pleasures. I had been deliberately avoiding Trevor's calls for the past week, letting them go to voicemail while I tried to figure out how to proceed with my growing suspicions. His messages had become increasingly urgent and demanding, wanting to know why I wasn't answering, whether I was experiencing health problems, and when he could come visit to check on my condition. The possessive tone of his communications only reinforced my belief that he had stopped seeing me as an autonomous person with the right to privacy and independence. That Tuesday morning, I made the decision to drive into town and speak with Margaret Chen, the attorney who had handled Raymond's estate and had been our family lawyer for over 20 years. Margaret was someone I trusted completely, a woman of integrity who had always given me honest advice, even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. If anyone could help me understand my legal situation and my options for protecting myself, it would be Margaret. I was gathering my purse and car keys when I heard a vehicle turning into my driveway. Through the front window, I saw Trevor's BMW approaching the house, followed by a white van with the logo of a medical equipment company emblazoned on its side. My heart began racing as I realized that Trevor hadn't just come for an unexpected visit. He had brought what appeared to be medical personnel with him. Trevor stepped out of his car with a confident stride, followed by Celeste, and two people I didn't recognize, a middle-aged man in a business suit, and a woman wearing medical scrubs who was carrying a large black bag. The group approached my front door with the purposeful demeanor of people executing a planned intervention, and I suddenly understood that whatever was about to happen had been carefully orchestrated in advance. I opened the door before they could knock, hoping to maintain some semblance of control over the situation, but Trevor immediately began speaking in the tone he might use with a confused child rather than his mother. He explained that he had become increasingly worried about my mental state based on our recent phone conversations, and that he had consulted with medical professionals about the best way to ensure my safety and well-being. The man in the business suit introduced himself as Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in age-related cognitive decline and mental health issues affecting elderly individuals. The woman in scrubs was Patricia Mills, a psychiatric nurse practitioner who would be assisting with my evaluation. Trevor had arranged for them to conduct a comprehensive assessment of my mental and physical condition, right there in my own home, to determine whether I was still capable of living independently. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief that my own son would ambush me with uninvited medical professionals, but I forced myself to remain calm and composed. I told Dr. Hawthorne and Ms. Mills that while I appreciated their professional expertise, I had not requested or consented to any medical evaluation, and I was not comfortable proceeding with an assessment that had been arranged without my knowledge or participation. Trevor immediately stepped in to explain that my reluctance to cooperate with the evaluation was exactly the kind of concerning behavior that had prompted him to seek professional intervention. He said that elderly people experiencing cognitive decline often became paranoid and resistant to help, and that my refusal to participate was actually evidence that I needed immediate assistance. His words were delivered with such conviction and apparent concern that the medical professionals began looking at me with the sympathetic but patronizing expressions typically reserved for patients who lack insight into their own conditions. Dr. Hawthorne spoke to me in the gentle but condescending tone that medical professionals often use with elderly patients they assume are confused or impaired. He explained that Trevor had shared his concerns about my recent behavior, including my apparent paranoia about the life insurance policy, my resistance to reasonable safety measures, and my increasing isolation from family and social support systems. The doctor suggested that a brief evaluation would help everyone understand my current capabilities and ensure that I was receiving appropriate care. I realized that Trevor had already provided these professionals with a narrative that portrayed me as a declining elderly woman who was becoming paranoid, resistant to help, and potentially unable to make rational decisions about my own welfare. By arranging this surprise evaluation, He was forcing me into a situation where my refusal to cooperate would be interpreted as evidence of the very problems he claimed to be addressing. Celeste, who had remained silent during the initial introductions, finally spoke up to support Trevor's concerns. She said that during their recent visits, she had noticed changes in my behavior and cognitive function that worried her as someone who cared about my well-being. She mentioned that I seemed more forgetful, more suspicious of others' motives, and less capable of managing complex decisions about my health and finances. Her betrayal stung even more than Trevor's because I had genuinely believed that Celeste cared about me as a person rather than just as an obstacle to her husband's inheritance. I had welcomed her into my family, shared my memories and my home with her, and treated her with the love and respect I would have shown my own daughter. To discover that she was willing to participate in what felt like a coordinated attack on my autonomy was devastating. Dr. Hawthorne suggested that we all sit down in my living room to discuss the situation in a more comfortable setting. He said that he understood my reluctance to participate in an evaluation that had been arranged without my direct involvement, but he emphasized that Trevor's concerns were serious enough to warrant professional attention. The doctor positioned himself as a neutral party, who was simply trying to ensure that everyone's best interests were being served. As we moved into the living room, I noticed that Ms. Mills was setting up what appeared to be monitoring equipment near the area where they obviously expected me to sit. The equipment included a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, and several other medical devices that would allow them to gather data about my physical condition during our conversation. The presence of this equipment made it clear that they had come prepared to conduct a full evaluation, regardless of my consent. Trevor chose a chair that positioned him directly across from me, while Celeste sat slightly behind him in a configuration that felt more like an interrogation than a family meeting. Dr. Hawthorne took the role of lead questioner, pulling out a tablet computer and explaining that he would be asking me a series of questions designed to assess my cognitive function, my understanding of my current situation, and my ability to make informed decisions about my care. The questions began innocuously enough, focusing on basic orientation information like the current date, my location, and my understanding of why everyone was gathered in my living room. I answered these questions accurately and completely, but I could sense that Dr. Hawthorne was evaluating not just my responses but also my demeanor, my emotional state, and my willingness to cooperate with the process. As the questioning continued, Dr. Hawthorne began asking about my relationships with family members, my social activities, and my daily routines. Many of his questions seemed designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as evidence of paranoia, social isolation, or functional decline. When he asked about my relationship with Trevor, I found myself in an impossible position, where answering honestly about my recent concerns would be taken as evidence of paranoid thinking, while providing false reassurances would validate Trevor's narrative about my supposed cognitive decline. Trevor participated in the evaluation by providing what he characterized as objective observations about changes in my behavior and capabilities. He described incidents that he claimed demonstrated my increasing forgetfulness, confusion, and poor judgment. Many of these incidents were either completely fabricated or twisted distortions of normal behaviors that he was reframing as evidence of cognitive impairment. For example, Trevor told Dr. Hawthorne that I had recently forgotten about a doctor's appointment, when in reality I had deliberately rescheduled the appointment because of a conflict with other commitments. He said that I had become confused about my medications, when what had actually happened was that I had questioned him about why he was so interested in the details of my prescriptions. He described my resistance to his suggestions about moving to a senior living facility as evidence that I was unable to make rational decisions about my own safety. Each of Trevor's examples was technically based on real events, but his interpretations of those events were designed to support a narrative of cognitive decline and poor judgment. Dr. Hawthorne took careful notes of everything Trevor said, and I could see that the doctor was beginning to form an impression of me as a woman who was indeed experiencing significant problems with memory, judgment, and reality testing. When Dr. Hawthorne asked me to respond to Trevor's concerns, I faced the terrible realization that anything I said in my own defense would likely be interpreted as further evidence of the problems they were alleging. If I explained that I had been deliberately avoiding Trevor's calls because I was concerned about his motives, that would be seen as paranoid thinking. If I described my discovery of the life insurance policy as evidence of Trevor's questionable intentions, that would be characterized as delusional interpretation of normal financial planning. I chose my words carefully, explaining that I appreciated Trevor's concern for my well-being, but that I felt capable of managing my own affairs and making my own decisions about my health and living situation. I said that while I valued his input and advice, I didn't believe that I needed the level of supervision and control that he seemed to think was necessary. Dr. Hawthorne asked me specific questions about the life insurance policy that Trevor had mentioned as a source of my recent paranoid concerns. He wanted to know why I found it troubling that my son had taken steps to protect the family's financial interests, and whether I understood that such policies were common forms of estate planning among affluent families. I tried to explain that my concern wasn't about the existence of the policy itself, but about the fact that it had been obtained without my knowledge or consent, and that Trevor's behavior since I discovered it had made me question his motives. But even as I spoke, I could hear how my words might sound to someone who had already been primed to see me as a paranoid elderly woman who was misinterpreting her son's loving concern. Ms. Mills conducted a series of physical assessments during our conversation, monitoring my blood pressure, heart rate, and other vital signs, while Dr. Hawthorne continued his questioning. She also administered what she described as basic cognitive tests, asking me to remember lists of words, perform simple calculations, and demonstrate my understanding of abstract concepts. I performed well on all of the cognitive tests, answering questions accurately and demonstrating that my mental faculties were functioning normally. But I could sense that Dr. Hawthorne was more interested in my emotional responses and my attitudes toward family relationships than in my actual cognitive capabilities. The evaluation seemed designed to pathologize my resistance to Trevor's control rather than to objectively assess my mental competence. The most devastating part of the evaluation came when Dr. Hawthorne asked me to describe my current living situation and my plans for the future. As I talked about my desire to remain in my family home, to maintain my independence, and to make my own decisions about my care, I could see that my words were being interpreted as evidence of unrealistic thinking and poor judgment. Trevor provided commentary throughout my responses, pointing out what he characterized as examples of my impaired reasoning and my inability to recognize my own limitations. He said that my insistence on living alone in an isolated farmhouse demonstrated poor judgment about safety issues. He suggested that my resistance to regular medical monitoring showed a lack of insight into age-related health risks. He characterized my suspicions about the life insurance policy as evidence of paranoid thinking that was interfering with our family relationship. Dr. Hawthorne seemed to accept Trevor's characterizations without much critical examination, and I began to understand that this evaluation had been designed to reach predetermined conclusions rather than to conduct an objective assessment of my capabilities. The doctor had apparently been briefed in advance about what Trevor wanted the evaluation to show, and the questions and observations were structured to support that narrative. When the formal evaluation concluded, Dr. Hawthorne asked to speak privately with Trevor and Celeste, while I remained in the living room with Ms. Mills. Through the thin walls of the old farmhouse, I could hear fragments of their conversation in the kitchen. Dr. Hawthorne was explaining that while my cognitive function appeared to be intact, my judgment and insight were clearly compromised by what he characterized as age-related paranoia and resistance to appropriate care. The doctor recommended that Trevor seek legal guardianship to ensure that I received proper supervision and medical care. He suggested that my current living situation was unsafe and inappropriate for someone with my apparent level of impaired judgment. He said that my resistance to family involvement in my care decisions was a common symptom of age-related mental health issues, and that court-ordered supervision might be necessary to protect my well-being. When Trevor, Celeste, and Dr. Hawthorne returned to the living room, the doctor delivered his recommendations with the kind of professional authority that made them sound like medical necessities rather than personal opinions. He explained that while I was not experiencing dementia or severe cognitive impairment, I was showing signs of what he called age-related decisional incapacity that made it unsafe for me to continue living independently without supervision. Dr. Hawthorne recommended that I undergo a more comprehensive evaluation at a specialized geriatric facility, where a team of professionals could conduct detailed assessments of my physical health, cognitive function, and psychosocial needs. He said that this evaluation would provide a clearer picture of what level of care and supervision would be most appropriate for my current condition. Trevor accepted Dr. Hawthorne's recommendations with what appeared to be reluctant acceptance of a difficult but necessary medical decision. He said that while it pained him to acknowledge that I needed more intensive care, He was committed to ensuring that I received whatever help was required to keep me safe and healthy. His performance was masterful, conveying the impression of a devoted son who was making difficult decisions based on professional medical advice. As Dr. Hawthorne and Ms. Shen Mills packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, the doctor handed Trevor a folder containing what he described as preliminary documentation of my evaluation results. He said that these materials would be helpful if Trevor decided to pursue legal guardianship or other interventions to ensure my proper care. After the medical professionals left, Trevor sat down across from me with the folder in his hands and an expression of grave concern on his face. He said that while he had hoped Dr. Hawthorne would find that my recent behavior was just a temporary adjustment to aging, the evaluation had confirmed his worst fears about my declining judgment and capacity for independent living. Trevor explained that he now had a moral and legal obligation to ensure that I received appropriate care, even if that meant making decisions that I might not initially understand or appreciate. He said that the comprehensive evaluation Dr. Hawthorne had recommended would need to be completed as soon as possible, and that depending on the results, we might need to make significant changes to my living situation and care arrangements. When I protested that I felt perfectly capable of managing my own affairs and that I didn't consent to any additional evaluations or interventions, Trevor's demeanor shifted to the patient but firm tone he might use with a confused child. He said that my resistance to help was exactly what Dr. Hawthorne had warned him to expect, and that it was evidence of the very problems that needed to be addressed. Celeste supported Trevor's position, saying that she had noticed changes in my behavior during their recent visits that concerned her as someone who cared about my well-being. She said that while she understood my desire to maintain independence, she also recognized that sometimes people needed help recognizing when they could no longer safely manage on their own. The two of them presented a united front of loving concern and reluctant responsibility, but I could see the calculation behind their expressions of compassion. They had successfully positioned themselves as the rational, caring family members who were trying to help a declining elderly woman who lacked insight into her own condition. Any resistance I offered would be interpreted as further evidence of my supposed impairment. Trevor said that he would be scheduling the comprehensive evaluation for the following week, and that in the meantime, he thought it would be best if someone stayed with me to ensure my safety. He had already made arrangements for a private care companion to move into the farmhouse temporarily, someone who could monitor my condition and provide assistance with daily activities, while also ensuring that I didn't engage in any unsafe behaviors. The care companion Trevor had selected was a woman named Dorothy Hines, who had extensive experience working with elderly clients experiencing cognitive and behavioral issues. Dorothy would arrive the next morning and would essentially be living in my home as a combination housekeeper, medical monitor, and behavioral supervisor. Trevor presented this arrangement as a temporary safety measure, but I understood it was actually the first step in a process designed to strip me of my independence and autonomy. When I objected to having a stranger move into my home without my consent, Trevor said that my resistance proved that I was unable to make rational decisions about my own safety. He said that Dr. Hawthorne had warned him that I might react negatively to appropriate interventions, and that this reaction was actually a symptom of my underlying condition rather than a legitimate expression of my preferences. As Trevor and Celeste prepared to leave that afternoon, I realized that I had been trapped in a web of medical authority and family concern that would be almost impossible to escape. They had created a narrative in which any action I took to protect myself would be interpreted as evidence of the very problems they claimed to be addressing. If I sought legal help, that would be seen as paranoid behavior. If I tried to contact friends or other family members, that would be characterized as confusion and poor judgment. Trevor hugged me goodbye with what appeared to be genuine affection and concern, telling me that he loved me and that everything he was doing was for my own good. He said that he knew these changes were difficult and frightening, but that I needed to trust him to make the right decisions for my care and protection. His words were spoken with such apparent sincerity that for a moment I almost doubted my own perceptions of what was happening. But as I watched Trevor's BMW disappear down the driveway, followed by Celeste waving from the passenger seat, I understood with perfect clarity that I had just experienced a carefully orchestrated attack on my freedom and autonomy. My son had used medical professionals as weapons to pathologize my resistance to his control, and he had established the legal and medical foundation for taking complete control of my life and assets. That evening, as I sat alone in the farmhouse that would soon be invaded by a supervisor disguised as a caregiver, I faced the terrible reality that Trevor had moved beyond planning for my death to actively working to destroy my life while I was still living it. The comprehensive evaluation he had scheduled would undoubtedly reach the conclusions he wanted it to reach, and the care arrangements he was putting in place would isolate me from anyone who might help me resist his plans. I had perhaps 12 hours before Dorothy Hines arrived to begin monitoring my every move and reporting back to Trevor about my activities and behaviors. 12 hours to figure out how to protect myself from a trap that had been months or even years in the making. 12 hours to find a way to fight back against someone who had turned my own love for him into a weapon against me. The boy I had raised, the son I had sacrificed for and loved unconditionally, had become the greatest threat to my safety and freedom that I had ever faced. And if I wanted to survive what he had planned for me, I was going to have to become someone I had never imagined I could be, a mother willing to destroy her own child to save herself. That night marked the beginning of what I now think of as my awakening. Not the gentle, gradual awakening of someone slowly coming to terms with a difficult truth, but the sharp, immediate awakening of someone whose survival depends on instant clarity and decisive action. I had exactly 10 hours before Dorothy Hines would arrive to begin what Trevor had positioned as my care, but what I understood to be my imprisonment. I sat at Raymond's old desk in the study, the room where he had managed our family's affairs for 40 years, and I began to methodically inventory every resource I possessed. Not just my financial assets or legal documents, but every relationship, every piece of knowledge, every advantage that Trevor might not know about or might have underestimated. If I was going to fight for my freedom, I needed to understand exactly what weapons were available to me. The first thing I did was locate the folder where Raymond had kept copies of all our important legal documents. Raymond had been obsessively organized about record-keeping, and I knew that somewhere in his files was information that Trevor had either forgotten about or never known existed. As I went through folder after folder of contracts, deeds, and financial records, I found exactly what I had hoped to find: documentation that Trevor had never seen. Hidden in a manila envelope marked Personal RH was a copy of Raymond's original will, along with several codicils and amendments that had been executed over the years. Most importantly, there was a letter of instruction that Raymond had written to me shortly before his death, explaining certain provisions of our estate plan that he had never discussed with Trevor. Raymond's letter revealed that he had harbored his own concerns about Trevor's character and judgment, particularly regarding money and family relationships. While Raymond had loved his son, he had also observed Trevor's calculating approach to financial matters and his tendency to view relationships in terms of personal advantage. As a result, Raymond had structured our estate plan with several protective mechanisms that were designed to prevent Trevor from gaining complete control over our assets. The most significant protection was a clause in Raymond's will that required Trevor to meet certain conditions before inheriting the bulk of our estate. These conditions included maintaining a respectful and supportive relationship with me, demonstrating financial responsibility in his own affairs, and agreeing to preserve the family property for future generations. If Trevor failed to meet these conditions, or if there was evidence that he was attempting to harm or exploit me, his inheritance would be redirected to a charitable foundation that Raymond had established. Even more importantly, Raymond had given me the power to make this determination. A provision in his will specifically stated that if I believed Trevor was acting against my best interests or attempting to harm me in any way, I could trigger the alternative distribution of the estate simply by filing a notarized statement with our attorney. This provision had been carefully worded to give me broad discretion in determining what constituted harmful behavior, and it was designed to protect me from exactly the kind of situation I now found myself facing. Reading Raymond's letter felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave, a reminder that my husband had understood our son better than I had given him credit for. Raymond had loved Trevor, but had also recognized his potential for selfishness and manipulation. The protections he had built into our estate plan were his way of ensuring that his love for his son didn't blind him to the possibility that Trevor might one day become a threat to my well-being. The second crucial document I found was a power of attorney that I had completely forgotten about. Years earlier, when Raymond was dealing with health issues that required frequent medical treatments, I had asked my friend Sarah Whitfield to serve as my backup power of attorney in case anything happened to both Raymond and me simultaneously. Sarah was a retired nurse who lived about an hour away, and she was someone I trusted completely to act in my best interests rather than her own. The power of attorney document was still valid, and it specifically stated that Sarah's authority would take precedence over any family member's claims if there was evidence that family members were acting against my interests. This meant that if Trevor succeeded in having me declared incompetent, Sarah could potentially challenge any guardianship arrangements and ensure that I had independent representation in any legal proceedings. I realized that Trevor's entire plan depended on his assumption that I was isolated and helpless, with no resources or allies that he didn't know about or couldn't control. The medical evaluation he had arranged was designed to create documentation that would support a guardianship petition, and the care companion he was installing in my home would provide ongoing evidence of my supposed need for supervision. But Trevor didn't know about Raymond's protective provisions, and he didn't know about Sarah's power of attorney. Armed with this knowledge, I began planning my counterattack. I couldn't simply wait for Trevor to complete his plan and then try to defend myself in court after he had already established a narrative of my incompetence. I needed to act preemptively, using the legal tools Raymond had provided while I still had the freedom and credibility to use them effectively. My first step was to contact Margaret Chen, our family attorney, despite the late hour. Margaret and I had a relationship that went back decades, and I knew she would take my call even in the middle of the night if I told her it was an emergency. When I explained what had happened during the medical evaluation and what Trevor was planning, Margaret was immediately concerned and completely supportive. Margaret confirmed that the protections Raymond had built into our estate plan were still valid and enforceable, and she agreed that Trevor's behavior could easily be interpreted as harmful to my interests under the terms of Raymond's will. She advised me to document everything that had happened, including the surprise medical evaluation and Trevor's threats to have me declared incompetent. She also suggested that we needed to act quickly to establish my competence and independence before Trevor could build a more compelling case for my incapacity. Margaret agreed to meet me at her office first thing in the morning, before Dorothy Hines was scheduled to arrive at my house. She would bring a court-certified mental health professional who could conduct an independent evaluation of my cognitive abilities, providing documentation that would counter any claims Trevor might make about my incompetence. She would also help me prepare the legal documents necessary to trigger the alternative distribution of Raymond's estate, effectively disinheriting Trevor before he could gain control of my assets. The second call I made was to Sarah Whitfield, who was shocked to learn about Trevor's behavior but immediately agreed to activate her power of attorney and serve as my advocate in any legal proceedings. Sarah had extensive experience dealing with elder abuse cases through her work as a nurse, and she recognized the pattern of Trevor's behavior as a textbook example of financial and psychological exploitation. Sarah offered to drive to Cedar Springs immediately and stay with me until we could figure out how to handle the Dorothy Hines situation. Having Sarah present when Dorothy arrived would complicate Trevor's narrative about my need for supervision, since it would demonstrate that I had supportive relationships and resources that he couldn't control. Sarah's presence would also provide a witness to any inappropriate behavior on Dorothy's part. My third call was to Detective James Crawford at the Cedar Springs Police Department. Jim was someone I had known since he was a boy, the son of one of my neighbors, who had grown up to become a respected law enforcement officer. When I explained that my son had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me without my knowledge and was now attempting to have me declared incompetent, Jim immediately understood the implications. Jim explained that while the life insurance policy itself wasn't necessarily illegal, the combination of the policy with Trevor's efforts to control my living situation and medical care created a pattern that warranted investigation. He advised me to document everything Trevor had done and said, and he offered to conduct a welfare check at my house if I felt threatened or unsafe at any point. More importantly, Jim suggested that I should consider filing for a restraining order against Trevor if his behavior continued to escalate. A restraining order would create an official legal record of my concerns about Trevor's intentions, and it would make it much more difficult for him to claim that he was acting in my best interests. The existence of a restraining order would also complicate any guardianship proceedings, since courts are reluctant to grant guardianship to someone who has been accused of threatening or harassing the proposed ward. By 3 a.m, I had assembled a team of allies and established a plan of action that would allow me to fight back against Trevor's scheme. Margaret would handle the legal aspects of protecting my estate and establishing my competence. Sarah would provide personal support and advocacy to ensure that I wasn't isolated or manipulated. Jim would investigate the potential criminal aspects of Trevor's behavior and provide law enforcement support if I needed protection. But I knew that having allies and legal protections wouldn't be enough if I couldn't also neutralize the immediate threat posed by Dorothy Hines and the comprehensive evaluation Trevor had scheduled. I needed a way to demonstrate that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs while also exposing the flaws in Trevor's narrative about my supposed incompetence. That's when I remembered the security system that Trevor had installed in my house the previous year. He had presented it as a safety measure for an elderly woman living alone, but I had always suspected that his interest in the system went beyond simple security concerns. Trevor had insisted on a particular model that included interior cameras and audio recording capabilities, ostensibly to help me summon help if I fell or experienced a medical emergency. At the time, I had been grateful for Trevor's thoughtfulness in ensuring my safety, but now I realized that the system could be used to monitor my behavior and gather evidence that could be used against me in competency proceedings. However, the same system could also work in my favor if I could use it to document inappropriate behavior by Dorothy Hines, or to record conversations that would expose Trevor's true motivations. I spent the next hour learning how to operate the security system's recording functions, something Trevor had never bothered to teach me because he assumed I wouldn't be interested in the technical details. The system was more sophisticated than I had realized, capable of recording high-quality audio and video that could be stored on remote servers and accessed from any computer with internet access. I activated the recording functions in the main living areas of the house, ensuring that any interactions with Dorothy Hines would be documented. I also set up the system to automatically upload recordings to a secure cloud storage account that only I could access, preventing Trevor from deleting or modifying any evidence that might be captured. As dawn broke over the hills surrounding my property, I felt more prepared for the battle ahead than I had since this nightmare began. I had legal protections that Trevor didn't know about, allies who would support me against his schemes, and the technological tools necessary to document his inappropriate behavior. Most importantly, I had regained my sense of agency and determination. At 7 a.m, Margaret Chen arrived at my house with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a geriatric psychiatrist, who specialized in competency evaluations for legal proceedings. Dr. Morrison was everything that Dr. Hawthorne had not been: thorough, objective, and committed to conducting an evaluation based on established medical standards rather than predetermined conclusions. Dr. Morrison spent 3 hours conducting a comprehensive assessment of my cognitive abilities, emotional state, and functional capabilities. Unlike Dr. Hawthorne's superficial questioning, Dr. Morrison's evaluation included standardized psychological tests, detailed interviews about my life history and current situation, and careful observation of my behavior and demeanor. The results of Dr. Morrison's evaluation were unambiguous. I was cognitively intact, emotionally stable, and fully capable of making informed decisions about my own care and finances. Dr. Morrison found no evidence of dementia, depression, or any other mental health condition that would impair my judgment or decision-making abilities. Her written report explicitly contradicted the preliminary findings that Dr. Hawthorne had provided to Trevor. While Dr. Morrison was completing her evaluation, Margaret was preparing the legal documents necessary to trigger the alternative distribution of Raymond's estate. The notarized statement required under Raymond's will was surprisingly simple. I needed only to attest that I believed Trevor was acting against my best interests and attempting to harm me through his efforts to control my living situation and financial affairs. Signing that document was one of the most difficult things I had ever done, not because I doubted its necessity, but because it represented the final severing of the maternal bond that had defined so much of my identity. By triggering the alternative distribution of Raymond's estate, I was effectively disowning my own son and acknowledging that he had become my enemy rather than my child. But I also felt a profound sense of relief as I signed my name to the document. For months, I had been trying to reconcile my love for Trevor with my growing awareness of his malicious intentions. The legal action I was taking allowed me to stop pretending that Trevor's behavior was motivated by concern for my well-being, and to acknowledge the reality that he was willing to destroy my life to gain access to my assets. Margaret filed the necessary paperwork with the court that morning, ensuring that Trevor's inheritance would be redirected to Raymond's charitable foundation, regardless of what happened to me. This action wouldn't necessarily protect me from physical harm, but it would eliminate Trevor's financial incentive for wanting me dead or incapacitated. At exactly 10 o'clock, Dorothy Hines arrived at my house in a white sedan with medical equipment visible in the back seat. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a professional demeanor that managed to be both friendly and authoritative. Dorothy introduced herself as someone who specialized in providing care for elderly clients experiencing various health and cognitive challenges. I invited Dorothy into my house with perfect politeness, but I made sure that Sarah was prominently visible in the living room and that the security cameras were recording our entire interaction. Dorothy seemed surprised to find that I had a visitor, and she asked several questions about Sarah's relationship to me and her reason for being present. When I explained that Sarah was a close friend who was staying with me temporarily, Dorothy said that Trevor hadn't mentioned that I had overnight guests, and that she would need to call him to clarify her responsibilities in this situation. I told Dorothy that she was welcome to call Trevor, but that Sarah was my friend and guest, and I didn't require Trevor's permission to have visitors in my own home. Dorothy's response to this situation revealed a great deal about the true nature of her assignment. Rather than accepting my explanation and adapting to the circumstances she found, Dorothy became insistent that she needed to speak with Trevor immediately to clarify the scope of her authority and responsibilities. Her reaction suggested that she had been hired not just to provide care but to maintain control over my environment and activities. When Trevor arrived at my house an hour later, he was clearly agitated by the unexpected presence of Sarah and the disruption to his carefully planned arrangements. Trevor demanded to know who Sarah was and why she was interfering with the care arrangements he had made for my safety and well-being. His tone was possessive and controlling in a way that made it obvious he saw my house as his property rather than my home. Sarah's response to Trevor was everything I could have hoped for. She introduced herself as my longtime friend and activated power of attorney, and she made it clear that she was there to ensure that my rights and interests were being protected. Sarah's nursing background and professional demeanor made it difficult for Trevor to dismiss her as a meddling friend or to characterize her presence as evidence of my poor judgment. The confrontation that followed was captured in its entirety by the security system, providing a permanent record of Trevor's true character when he was frustrated and off guard. Trevor accused Sarah of interfering with legitimate medical care, threatened to have her removed from the property, and made several statements that revealed his assumption that he had the right to control my living situation and personal relationships. Sarah remained calm and professional throughout Trevor's outburst, repeatedly pointing out that I was a competent adult who had the right to make my own decisions about my care and living situation. She asked Trevor to provide documentation of any legal authority he claimed to have over my affairs, and when he couldn't produce such documentation, she made it clear that his demands had no legal basis. The most damaging moment for Trevor came when he demanded to know why I was suddenly resisting the reasonable care arrangements he had made for my safety. Sarah pointed out that my resistance wasn't sudden at all, but was a rational response to discovering that Trevor had taken out a life insurance policy on me without my knowledge or consent. Trevor's response to this observation was telling. Instead of explaining or defending his actions, he became defensive and accused Sarah of encouraging my paranoid delusions. Dorothy Hines found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as it became clear that the situation was not what Trevor had led her to believe. When Sarah asked Dorothy to explain exactly what services she had been hired to provide, Dorothy's answers revealed that she had been given instructions that went far beyond normal companion care. She had been told to monitor my medication compliance, restrict my access to telephone and internet communications, and report any concerning behaviors to Trevor on a daily basis. These instructions constituted supervision and control rather than care and assistance, and Sarah's questioning made it clear that Dorothy had been hired to facilitate Trevor's efforts to isolate and control me, rather than to provide legitimate medical or personal care. Dorothy began to realize that she had been drawn into a situation that might have legal and ethical implications for her professional license. When Sarah asked to see the comprehensive evaluation appointment that Trevor had scheduled for me, Dorothy reluctantly admitted that the evaluation was scheduled for the following day at a facility that specialized in assessing elderly patients for placement in supervised care environments. The evaluation was not designed to determine whether I needed assistance. It was designed to provide documentation that would support Trevor's efforts to have me declared incompetent and placed in institutional care. The revelation about the true purpose of the evaluation was the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate that Trevor's entire plan was designed to strip me of my autonomy and control my assets, rather than to provide appropriate care for any legitimate medical needs. Sarah immediately called Margaret Chen to report this information and to request emergency legal intervention to prevent the evaluation from proceeding. Margaret advised us that the combination of the life insurance policy, the inappropriate care arrangements, and the coercive evaluation schedule provided sufficient evidence to seek an emergency restraining order against Trevor. She said that a judge would likely find that Trevor's behavior constituted elder abuse and financial exploitation, and that a restraining order would provide immediate legal protection while we developed a more comprehensive response. That afternoon, accompanied by Sarah and Margaret, I appeared before Judge Patricia Henley at the Cedar Springs County Courthouse to request an emergency restraining order against my own son. It was a moment that would have been unimaginable to me just weeks earlier, but sitting in that courtroom, I felt nothing but determination and clarity about the necessity of my actions. Judge Henley reviewed the evidence we presented, including Dr. Morrison's competency evaluation, documentation of the unauthorized life insurance policy, and recordings of Trevor's threatening behavior towards Sarah and me. The judge was particularly troubled by the pattern of behavior we described, noting that the combination of financial planning for my death with efforts to control my living situation created a clear threat to my safety and well-being. The restraining order was granted immediately, prohibiting Trevor from coming within 500 feet of my property, contacting me directly or through third parties, and making any decisions about my medical care or living arrangements. The order also required Trevor to provide documentation of the life insurance policy and to explain his actions to a court-appointed investigator within 72 hours. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, I felt like I had been reborn. For the first time in months, I was legally protected from Trevor's schemes, and I had taken control of my own destiny rather than waiting passively for him to destroy my life. The restraining order would make it impossible for Trevor to continue his campaign of manipulation and control, and it would provide a legal foundation for any future actions I might need to take to protect myself. But I also knew that the legal protection was only the beginning of my fight for freedom. Trevor would not accept defeat easily, and he would likely attempt to find new ways to gain control of my assets and my life. The restraining order had bought me time and legal standing, but I would need to use that advantage wisely to ensure that Trevor could never again threaten my safety or autonomy. That evening, as Sarah and I sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson, I realized that I had not only survived Trevor's betrayal but had emerged from it stronger and more determined than I had been in years. The ordeal had stripped away my illusions about family loyalty and unconditional love, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and resourcefulness that I hadn't known I possessed. For the first time since discovering the life insurance policy, I felt genuinely hopeful about my future. I had reclaimed control of my life and my assets, established legal protections against further exploitation, and surrounded myself with allies who would support my independence rather than undermine it. Trevor's plan to destroy me had failed, and in the process, it had liberated me from the burden of loving someone who had proven himself unworthy of that love. The restraining order changed everything, but not in the way I had expected. I had anticipated that the legal protection would provide me with peace and security, a chance to rebuild my life without the constant threat of Trevor's manipulation and control. Instead, the order seemed to unleash something darker and more desperate in my son, a willingness to escalate his efforts in ways that I hadn't imagined possible. The first sign that Trevor had no intention of accepting defeat came just 2 days after the restraining order was issued. Sarah had returned to her own home, confident that the legal protections were sufficient to keep me safe, and I was enjoying my first quiet evening alone in months when I heard a car approaching the house well after dark. The headlights swept across my bedroom window as the vehicle turned into my driveway, and my heart began racing as I realized that Trevor might be violating the restraining order already. But it wasn't Trevor's BMW that had arrived at my house. Instead, a black SUV with tinted windows parked near my front door, and 2 men in expensive suits emerged from the vehicle. They walked to my door with the confident stride of people who were accustomed to getting their way, and their knock was firm and authoritative, rather than polite or deferential. I watched them through the peephole for several moments before deciding to answer the door, keeping the security chain engaged as I spoke with them through the narrow opening. The older of the 2 men introduced himself as Marcus Reed, and he said that he represented a legal firm that was working on behalf of my family to resolve some unfortunate misunderstandings about my care and well-being. Reed explained that Trevor had hired their firm to address what he characterized as a situation involving elder abuse by unscrupulous individuals who were taking advantage of my declining mental state. According to Reed, Trevor was deeply concerned that people like Sarah and Margaret were manipulating me into making decisions that were harmful to both my immediate safety and my long-term financial interests. The story Reed told was a masterful inversion of reality, one that portrayed Trevor as a loving son who was desperately trying to protect his vulnerable mother from predatory advisors and caretakers. In this version of events, my resistance to Trevor's care arrangements was evidence of my cognitive impairment, and the restraining order was the result of manipulation by people who wanted to gain control of my assets for their own benefit. Reed said that his firm specialized in cases involving elderly individuals who had been isolated from their families and convinced to make legal and financial decisions that were not in their best interests. He suggested that Trevor was prepared to file a comprehensive legal challenge to the restraining order, including evidence that I was being financially exploited by my attorney and emotionally manipulated by my so-called friends. The implicit threat in Reed's visit was clear. If I didn't voluntarily dismiss the restraining order and cooperate with Trevor's original care plan, I would face a protracted legal battle that would drain my resources and potentially result in court-ordered supervision anyway. Reed painted a picture of expensive litigation, public scrutiny, and eventual defeat that was designed to convince me that cooperation with Trevor was my only viable option. But Reed had underestimated both my resolve and my resources. Instead of being intimidated by his threats, I was furious that Trevor had sent strangers to my home to pressure me into abandoning the legal protections I had fought so hard to obtain. I told Reed that I would be recording our conversation and that any future communications should be directed to my attorney rather than delivered to my home by uninvited visitors. Reed's demeanor shifted when he realized that I wasn't going to be easily intimidated. He became more aggressive in his tone, suggesting that my refusal to cooperate with reasonable family concerns was evidence of the very mental instability that Trevor was trying to address. He said that elderly people often became paranoid and resistant to help when they were experiencing cognitive decline, and that my hostility toward his visit was actually supporting Trevor's case for intervention. I ended the conversation by closing the door and immediately calling both Margaret Chen and Detective Crawford to report the visit. Margaret was concerned that Trevor was attempting to use intimidation tactics to circumvent the legal process, and she advised me to document everything about the encounter while the details were still fresh in my memory. Jim Crawford was even more direct in his assessment. He said that sending representatives to pressure me at my home could be construed as harassment and witness intimidation, both of which were violations of the restraining order even if Trevor himself hadn't physically approached my property. The next morning brought even more disturbing news. Margaret called to inform me that Trevor had indeed filed a comprehensive legal challenge to the restraining order, along with a petition for emergency guardianship, based on what he claimed was evidence of my mental incompetence and vulnerability to exploitation. The legal documents Trevor had filed painted a detailed picture of a declining elderly woman who was being manipulated by unscrupulous advisors into making decisions that were harmful to her own interests. Trevor's petition included affidavits from Dr. Hawthorne and Dorothy Hines, both of whom provided testimony that supported his claims about my cognitive impairment and need for supervision. Dr. Hawthorne's affidavit described me as exhibiting classic symptoms of age-related paranoia and poor judgment, while Dorothy's statement focused on my hostility toward appropriate care arrangements and my susceptibility to manipulation by outside influences. More troubling was the financial analysis that Trevor had included in his petition, which suggested that I had been making increasingly poor decisions about my assets and had recently transferred significant portions of my estate to people who might be taking advantage of my diminished capacity. This analysis was based on the legitimate legal actions I had taken to protect my estate from Trevor's schemes, but it was presented in a way that made those protective measures appear to be evidence of cognitive impairment and financial exploitation. Margaret explained that Trevor's legal strategy was sophisticated and potentially effective, particularly given the resources he was apparently willing to invest in the case. The attorneys he had hired were specialists in guardianship proceedings, and they had a track record of successfully obtaining court-ordered supervision for elderly individuals whose families claimed they were being exploited or manipulated. The guardianship petition would require a court hearing where Trevor would present his evidence of my alleged incompetence, and I would have the opportunity to defend my mental capacity and decision-making abilities. However, the burden of proof in such cases often favored family members who claimed to be concerned about an elderly relative's welfare, particularly when those family members could present professional medical testimony and evidence of concerning behavior. Margaret was confident that we could successfully defend against Trevor's petition, particularly given Dr. Morrison's comprehensive competency evaluation and the evidence we had gathered about Trevor's own questionable motivations. But she also warned me that the legal process would be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining, and that Trevor's resources might allow him to sustain the litigation longer than I could reasonably endure. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor who would prove to be crucial in the final resolution of my conflict with Trevor. Detective Crawford arrived at my house with a woman I had never met, someone he introduced as Agent Patricia Volkov from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Agent Volkov explained that my case had been brought to their attention as part of a broader investigation into insurance fraud and elder abuse schemes. Agent Volkov said that the TBI had been tracking a pattern of suspicious life insurance policies taken out on elderly individuals by family members, particularly in cases where those family members had subsequently sought guardianship or had been involved in incidents that resulted in their relatives' deaths. My situation fit the profile they had been investigating, and they were interested in determining whether Trevor's actions were part of a broader criminal scheme. The investigation that Agent Volkov described was far more extensive than I had imagined possible. The TBI had been working with insurance companies and medical professionals to identify cases where life insurance policies had been used as part of schemes to exploit or harm elderly individuals. They had found evidence of coordinated networks involving doctors, lawyers, and care facilities that worked together to identify vulnerable targets and facilitate their exploitation. Agent Volkov said that Dr. Hawthorne had appeared in several other cases involving questionable competency evaluations of elderly individuals whose families had subsequently gained control of their assets. Similarly, the law firm that Marcus Reed represented had been involved in multiple guardianship proceedings that had resulted in elderly individuals being placed in expensive care facilities while their assets were transferred to family members or other interested parties. The pattern that emerged from the TBI's investigation suggested that Trevor might not have developed his scheme independently, but might instead have been connected to a broader network of professionals who specialized in elder exploitation. This possibility transformed my situation from a family dispute into a potential criminal matter that could have far-reaching legal and financial consequences for everyone involved. Agent Volkov asked for my permission to conduct a comprehensive investigation into Trevor's activities, including his financial records, his communications with the various professionals involved in my case, and his connections to other similar schemes. She explained that such an investigation might take several months to complete, but that it could provide crucial evidence for both my guardianship defense and potential criminal charges against Trevor and his associates. I agreed to cooperate fully with the TBI investigation, not only because I wanted to protect myself from Trevor's schemes, but also because I was horrified by the possibility that other elderly individuals might be facing similar exploitation. The idea that my son might be part of a criminal network that targeted vulnerable seniors was almost too awful to contemplate, but it explained the sophistication and coordination of the efforts to undermine my autonomy. While the TBI investigation was beginning, I also had to deal with the immediate threat posed by Trevor's guardianship petition. Margaret scheduled a meeting with the court-appointed attorney who would represent my interests in the guardianship proceeding, and she began preparing a comprehensive defense that would demonstrate both my mental competence and Trevor's questionable motivations. The court-appointed attorney, David Kushner, was a veteran of guardianship proceedings who had extensive experience defending elderly individuals against unwanted supervision. David reviewed all the evidence we had gathered about Trevor's behavior, and he was particularly interested in the recordings from my security system that documented Trevor's threatening and controlling statements. David explained that guardianship cases often came down to competing narratives about the elderly person's capacity and needs, and that our success would depend on our ability to present a more compelling story than Trevor's legal team. We needed to demonstrate not only that I was mentally competent, but also that Trevor's motivations were financial rather than protective, and that his proposed care arrangements would be harmful rather than beneficial to my well-being. The preparation for the guardianship hearing was exhaustive and emotionally draining. David arranged for me to undergo additional psychological testing by multiple independent experts, ensuring that Trevor's legal team couldn't dismiss Dr. Morrison's evaluation as biased or inadequate. I also had to provide detailed documentation of my daily activities, financial management, and social relationships, to demonstrate that I was functioning independently and making rational decisions about my life. Perhaps most difficult was the process of documenting Trevor's abusive and manipulative behavior in a way that would be compelling to a judge who had never met either of us. I had to relive every threatening conversation, every manipulative encounter, every moment when I had felt unsafe or coerced by my own son. The security recordings helped provide objective evidence, but I also had to testify in detail about the emotional impact of Trevor's betrayal and exploitation. As the hearing date approached, I began to receive increasingly desperate communications from Trevor himself, despite the restraining order that prohibited direct contact. These communications came through intermediaries, including Celeste, distant relatives, and even some of my former friends who had been contacted by Trevor's representatives. The messages all carried variations of the same theme. Trevor loved me and was only trying to protect me, and if I would just dismiss the legal proceedings and cooperate with his care arrangements, we could restore our family relationship and move forward together. The emotional manipulation in these messages was sophisticated and painful, playing on my love for Trevor and my desire to believe that his actions were motivated by concern rather than greed. Trevor's representatives painted a picture of a grieving son who was devastated by the deterioration of his relationship with his mother, and who was willing to do anything necessary to ensure her safety and happiness. But I had moved beyond the point where such emotional appeals could influence my decisions. The evidence of Trevor's criminal behavior was too overwhelming, and the threat to my safety and autonomy was too immediate, for me to be swayed by appeals to family loyalty and maternal love. I had learned the difference between genuine care and manipulative control, and I would never again mistake the latter for the former. The guardianship hearing took place on a gray November morning in the same courthouse where I had obtained the restraining order months earlier. The courtroom was packed with lawyers, medical professionals, and other interested parties, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a criminal trial than a family proceeding. I sat with Margaret and David at one table, while Trevor and his legal team occupied another table across the room. Seeing Trevor in person for the first time since the restraining order was issued was more difficult than I had anticipated. Despite everything he had done, he was still my son, and there was a part of me that wanted to believe that this whole nightmare had been a terrible misunderstanding that could somehow be resolved with forgiveness and family reconciliation. Trevor looked tired and older than his years, and there were moments when his expression seemed genuinely pained rather than calculating. But those moments of doubt were quickly dispelled when Trevor's legal team began presenting their case. The portrayal of me that emerged from their testimony and evidence was devastating in its distortion of reality. According to their narrative, I was a paranoid, declining elderly woman who had been manipulated by unscrupulous advisors into making irrational decisions that were harmful to both my immediate safety and my long-term financial security. Dr. Hawthorne testified at length about his evaluation of my mental state, describing what he characterized as classic symptoms of age-related cognitive decline and paranoid ideation. He said that my resistance to appropriate medical care and my hostility toward family involvement in my affairs were consistent with the kind of impaired judgment that often affected elderly individuals who were no longer capable of making rational decisions about their own welfare. Dorothy Hines provided testimony about my alleged inability to manage basic activities of daily living and my susceptibility to manipulation by outside influences. She described incidents that she claimed to have witnessed during her brief time at my house, including what she characterized as confusion about medications, difficulty following simple instructions, and inappropriate trust in people who might be taking advantage of my diminished capacity. The financial experts that Trevor's team had hired presented a detailed analysis of my recent legal and financial decisions, arguing that the actions I had taken to protect my estate from Trevor were actually evidence of cognitive impairment and poor judgment. They suggested that I had been convinced to make changes to my estate plan that were not in my best interests, and that these changes were evidence of my vulnerability to financial exploitation. Throughout their presentation, Trevor's legal team maintained the narrative that he was a loving son who was desperately trying to protect his vulnerable mother from people who were taking advantage of her diminished mental capacity. They portrayed Trevor as someone who had reluctantly sought legal intervention, only after exhausting all other options for ensuring my safety and well-being. When it came time for our defense, David began by calling Dr. Morrison to testify about her comprehensive evaluation of my mental competence. Dr. Morrison's testimony was thorough and compelling, directly contradicting every claim that Dr. Hawthorne had made about my cognitive abilities and mental state. She explained that her evaluation had included standardized psychological tests, detailed cognitive assessments, and extensive interviews, all of which had demonstrated that I was mentally competent and capable of making informed decisions about my own care and finances. David then called Sarah to testify about her observations of Trevor's behavior and her professional assessment of the care arrangements he had attempted to impose. Sarah's testimony was particularly effective because of her medical background and her obvious lack of financial interest in the outcome of the case. She described Trevor's controlling and threatening behavior in clinical terms, explaining how his actions fit the pattern of psychological abuse and financial exploitation that she had encountered in her professional experience. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when David played selected recordings from my security system that captured Trevor's threatening statements and his acknowledgement of the life insurance policy. Hearing Trevor's own voice expressing his assumption that he had the right to control my living situation and make decisions about my medical care was devastating to his case, particularly when contrasted with his legal team's portrayal of him as a reluctant and caring son. Agent Volkov was called to testify about the TBI's investigation into Trevor's activities and the broader pattern of elder exploitation that his case appeared to represent. Her testimony revealed that Trevor had been in communication with several individuals who were subjects of ongoing criminal investigations, and that the coordination of his scheme suggested involvement in organized elder abuse activities. Perhaps most damaging to Trevor's case was the testimony about the life insurance policy itself. Agent Volkov explained that the policy had been obtained through false representations about my health status and my knowledge of the coverage, and that the timing of the policy's execution coincided with Trevor's initial efforts to gain control over my medical care and living situation. The final element of our defense was my own testimony, which David had prepared me for extensively. I spoke directly to the judge about my mental competence, my understanding of my financial affairs, and my rational reasons for seeking protection from Trevor's controlling and exploitive behavior. I explained how I had discovered the life insurance policy, how Trevor's behavior had changed after that discovery, and why I believed that my safety and autonomy were threatened by his actions. Most importantly, I testified about the emotional impact of Trevor's betrayal and the way his actions had forced me to choose between my safety and my love for my son. I explained that the legal actions I had taken were not the result of manipulation by outside advisors, but were rational responses to credible threats to my well-being and independence. The judge's decision came after a brief recess that felt like an eternity. Judge Henley began by acknowledging the complexity and emotional difficulty of the case, and she expressed sympathy for the family tragedy that had brought us to court. But she also made it clear that her decision would be based on the evidence rather than on emotional appeals or family relationships. Judge Henley found that the evidence clearly demonstrated my mental competence and my capacity to make informed decisions about my own care and finances. She noted that Dr. Morrison's evaluation was more comprehensive and objective than Dr. Hawthorne's assessment, and that the recorded evidence of Trevor's behavior contradicted his claims about acting in my best interests. More significantly, Judge Henley found that Trevor's actions constituted a pattern of financial exploitation and psychological abuse that made him unsuitable to serve as my guardian under any circumstances. She noted that the life insurance policy, the coordinated medical evaluation, and the attempts to isolate me from supportive relationships demonstrated a level of manipulation and control that was harmful rather than protective. The judge dismissed Trevor's guardianship petition entirely and issued an expanded restraining order that prohibited him from having any involvement in my medical care, financial affairs, or living arrangements. She also ordered Trevor to provide complete documentation of the life insurance policy and to submit to questioning by law enforcement regarding his activities related to my case. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound sadness. I had successfully defended my autonomy and protected myself from Trevor's schemes, but the victory had come at the cost of destroying my relationship with my only child. The boy I had raised and loved was now legally prohibited from contact with me, and the family I had cherished for decades had been irreparably fractured. But I also felt a deep sense of liberation and empowerment that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Raymond's death, I was truly independent and self-determining, free from the controlling influence of someone who had claimed to love me while working to destroy my freedom and safety. I had proven to myself and to the world that I was still capable of fighting for my rights and protecting my interests. The TBI investigation continued for several more months, ultimately resulting in criminal charges against Trevor, Dr. Hawthorne, and several other individuals who had been involved in similar elder exploitation schemes. Trevor was convicted of insurance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges that resulted in a substantial prison sentence and the forfeiture of his assets to compensate his victims. The criminal proceedings revealed the full extent of Trevor's deception and the sophisticated nature of the network he had been involved with. The investigation uncovered evidence that Trevor had been planning his scheme for years, carefully positioning himself to gain control of my assets while building relationships with professionals who could help him execute his plan. Most shocking was the discovery that Trevor had been researching methods for hastening my death in ways that would appear natural or accidental. Computer forensics revealed internet searches for information about medication interactions, household accidents, and other scenarios that could result in the death of an elderly person without arousing suspicion. While Trevor was never charged with attempted murder, the evidence suggested that his plans went far beyond financial exploitation. The insurance company that had issued the life insurance policy voluntarily voided the coverage and returned all premiums that had been paid, acknowledging that the policy had been obtained through fraudulent representations. They also implemented new procedures for verifying the knowledge and consent of elderly individuals before issuing policies on their lives. Dr. Hawthorne lost his medical license and was convicted of multiple counts of fraud and elder abuse related to his involvement in various exploitation schemes. The investigation revealed that he had been providing false medical evaluations for years, helping family members gain control of elderly relatives' assets in exchange for substantial payments. As for Dorothy Hines, she cooperated with the investigation and provided crucial evidence about the instructions she had received from Trevor and his legal team. Her testimony helped prosecutors understand the systematic nature of the scheme and the ways in which legitimate care services were being corrupted to facilitate elder abuse. In the months following the criminal proceedings, I began the process of rebuilding my life and healing from the trauma of Trevor's betrayal. I sold the farmhouse that held so many painful memories and moved to a smaller home in town, where I could be closer to friends and community support while maintaining my independence. I also became involved in advocacy work related to elder abuse prevention, speaking at conferences and workshops about my experience and the warning signs that other elderly individuals should watch for in their own families. My story became a cautionary tale that helped other seniors recognize and protect themselves from similar exploitation. The charitable foundation that had inherited Trevor's portion of Raymond's estate became a vehicle for supporting elder abuse prevention programs, and providing legal assistance to elderly individuals who were facing exploitation by family members or other trusted persons. In this way, Trevor's betrayal was transformed into a force for protecting other vulnerable seniors from similar harm. Sarah remained a close friend and supporter throughout the legal proceedings and beyond, and our friendship deepened as we both recognized how the crisis had revealed the true character of everyone involved. Margaret continued to serve as my attorney and advisor, helping me navigate the complex legal and financial issues that arose from the case. Detective Crawford and Agent Volkov both expressed their appreciation for my willingness to cooperate with their investigations and to speak publicly about my experience. They said that my case had helped them identify and prosecute a broader network of elder abuse schemes, and that my testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against multiple defendants. As I reflect on the entire experience, I am struck by how dramatically my life changed from the moment I discovered that life insurance policy on my kitchen counter. In a matter of months, I went from being a trusting mother who believed in the fundamental goodness of family relationships to being someone who understood that love and exploitation could coexist in the same person. The most difficult lesson I learned was that maternal love is not always returned in kind, and that the child you raise with devotion and sacrifice may grow up to see you as nothing more than an obstacle to their own desires. This knowledge is painful beyond description, but it is also liberating in its honesty and clarity. I also learned that vulnerability is not the same as helplessness, and that even elderly individuals who may be physically or emotionally vulnerable can still fight effectively for their rights and safety. The legal system, law enforcement, and professional support services are available to help seniors protect themselves from exploitation, but only if they have the courage to seek help and the wisdom to recognize when they need it. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that autonomy and independence are precious gifts that must be actively protected rather than passively assumed. The right to make decisions about your own life, even if those decisions seem unwise to others, is fundamental to human dignity and must never be surrendered without a fight. Trevor's attempt to steal my life ultimately failed, but not because he lacked the resources or the cunning to succeed. His scheme failed because I refused to accept the role of helpless victim that he had assigned to me, and because I was willing to fight for my freedom, even when that fight required me to destroy the relationship that had once meant more to me than my own life. In the end, I saved myself not through superior strength or intelligence, but through the simple recognition that I deserved better than what Trevor was offering me. That recognition gave me the courage to seek help, the wisdom to accept support from others, and the determination to persist, even when the legal and emotional costs seemed overwhelming. Today I live quietly but contentedly in my small house in town, surrounded by friends who value me for who I am rather than what I own. I have no contact with Trevor, who remains in prison, and I have made peace with the fact that our relationship cannot be repaired or restored. The mother who once would have sacrificed anything for her son no longer exists, and the woman who took her place is stronger, wiser, and more self-determined than she ever imagined possible. My story is not unique, unfortunately, but it is one that ended with justice and empowerment rather than exploitation and tragedy. I hope that by sharing it, I can help other elderly individuals recognize the warning signs of family exploitation and find the courage to protect themselves before it's too late. We all deserve to live our final years with dignity, autonomy, and safety, and we all have the right to fight for those things regardless of who threatens to take them away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.